Hello. I'm Michael Che. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science here at UCLA. Thank you for coming out on this chilly Southern California evening. We're so happy to have you here to celebrate the memory of Victor Wolfenstein, my colleague, our colleagues. We're so happy to have Judy and Moses here and all of Victor's family members. So lovely to have them here. We're really very... We're also very fortunate to have Davide Panagia giving the lecture today, so I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. And also, just to let you know, there is a reception afterwards, so please hang around for that. Okay, so I guess I just have a few remarks about Victor. Just wanted to share since we're thinking about him. So I just have three things. So when I came here to UCLA in 2001, I first learned about Victor through his discussions at faculty meetings. So I was a youngish professor then, and what always was remarkable about Victor is he always said things out of conviction, and it wasn't just stubbornness or petulance. It was a conviction which came out of sort of a moral conviction. He actually said things because he believed them. A lot of us will say things like, oh, this will make our department better. This is going to enhance our reputation. But Victor's mind was always on more important things. He always thought about what is just good, what is good for society, what is good for all of us. He had a different vision, and that's kind of what's so lacking, I think, often today, and I really miss that. That's my first impression of Victor. The second story I have of him is I was advising a student, Corey Gooding, who's now at the University of San Diego, and Victor was on Corey's thesis committee, and Corey said, well, now that Victor passed away, we had to find somebody else. I said, okay. And then we just a moment looked at each other and we realized we had the same kind of realization, which, you know, I'm not used to loss, I guess, given my age. We both had the same realization that we had both really lost something. It wasn't just, you know, the fact that we had to get somebody else to be on this thesis committee, but we lost kind of a person you could depend on, like a foothold, a kind of stepping stone, something you could rest your weight on, and something a person you know who could help you be the kind of person you wanted to be, who would help you be good. And that was a loss, and that was really the first time in my life I felt that loss. The third thing I want to say about Victor is he was a great musician, and he would sometimes play his guitar songs for his classes. And again, it wasn't something which was showy or performative. That's just who he was. If he thought he could make a concept clear through singing, through playing his guitar, that's what he would do. He just would give himself. It would not be some sort of decision he would make. That's just what he would do. And through the years, sometimes we'd play together, and soon before he passed away, we were able to play together, and a bunch of people in the department played together, and it was a lot of fun. And Victor was always very enthusiastic. He didn't even need to be coaxed. He was the kind of person who would just push ahead. And you know, as you know, the purpose of songs, when you sing a song, it's very hard to stop a song in the middle. You can't just sort of stop. You have to keep on going. That's kind of in the sense the whole point of a song. Like when you're in a march, when you're in a demonstration, that's why people chant. Is because it gives you a movement forward. And so sometimes when I think of Victor, I think, as long as we can just keep on singing, that movement forward will get us to where we need to be. So I'll give now a few remarks about Davide. So Davide joined our faculty, I think, in 2014. And I first remember reading some of his stuff on Hume, and I was thinking, he has this thing about Hume and like cinema, what's going on there? Because Hume wrote in 39, you know, cinema is a 20th century thing. So I was just really interested and impressed because I'm reading now from Davide's book, Impressions on Hume. So he's quoting Hume saying, if we follow Hume's empiricist admonitions, and this is Hume's words, begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of continued existence of their objects after they no longer appear to the senses. So the question here is, you see something, like maybe a bird, and then you see it again, and then you never see it again. How do you know the bird is the same bird? Or how do you know, like maybe the bird died and came back to life? How do you know? You don't know, right? So what Davide said is that in film, essentially, that's the same assumption which filmmakers make. That is, when you see a film, you see a scene about someone, and it cuts to someone else. And then you're just supposed to assume that that person's still alive, still kicking around, and might come back later. And so in some sense, the question which Humes asks is the same kind of assumption a filmmaker asks of us as film viewers. So I thought that was super interesting. Tonight, I think Davide is going to be talking about algorithms, and I just wanted to say that this is a super relevant and interesting talk. 20 years ago, we were not affected by algorithms very much, but now we were affected in a very deep way. Whether you got the email to come to this event was processed by an algorithm, like the Gmail algorithm, the spam filter algorithm. How you decided to get here was processed through an algorithm, like through Google Maps or something. Who your friends are, who you get to talk to, that's kind of an algorithm. Now, increasingly, who you marry, that's done by algorithms. So it's a pretty important thing. And even things like whether you get bailed out of a prison sentence now is very much affected by algorithms. So it's extremely now important, and our lives are affected by this in many ways, and in ways which are also very mysterious, even for the people who write these things. So very mysterious and unaccountable. So I think it's great that we have Davide's leadership to show us how to think about this, and also how this relates to Victor's work. So if you could join me now in welcoming Davide. Thank you so much.
So the algorithm isn't that successful tonight because we won't have sound, but that's okay. We don't need sound. There's just a couple of clips. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out, and thank you, Michael, for your introduction. Thank you, Judy, for inviting me. Thank you, Judy, for inviting me to give this lecture, which has been a lot of fun to work on, in part because of what happened last night. It wasn't my fault, but it's great that it happened for my lecture, so I'll take it. So the title of my lecture is Critical Political Theory Today, New Lessons from Victor Wolfenstein's writings. And I'm going to start in just a second, but I'm glad that Michael began with the mention of algorithms in the way that he did, because a lot of this work, I've been thinking about these things for a long time, and a lot of this work stems from just like what to me seems like an amazing thing that, probably my generation to some extent, the second marriage people of my generation, but certainly the generation after mine and every other generation afterwards, have probably an implicit trust in an algorithm more than they would in their parents or their family members in choosing a life partner. That is an amazing thing to think about in a relationship to a mathematical calculation. And it's, to me, a really important thing to think about as a political theorist, who's interested in the way in which people's sensibilities, perceptions, et cetera, shape their relationship to one another in politics. So that's where it's all starting from, to give you a sense of the kind of major drama. This is the title of the talk, as you can see, and I'll let this play in the meantime. We were going to listen to it, but you'll figure out what it is. And instead of listening to it, maybe I'll just explain it very quickly. This is a video of Obama talking. It would be a lot more effective if you could hear him swearing, which he does in this video, and you'll see why in just a second. It is a public service announcement that was done by Jordan Peele, and he will appear in the split screen in just a second. Just give it a moment. And it's actually Jordan Peele talking. What you've seen up until now is what is a deep fake, or what's known as a deep fake. That didn't exist 5 years ago, but over the past 5 years have been perfected to a degree that we couldn't have imagined. And in part, we've all been participating in this because deep fakes are successful because of our visual recognition phones. That's where all the data is being drawn and how they're being processed. Anyway. So many of you in this room have cherished memories of Victor Wolfenstein, of his lessons, and it is one of the virtues of a good teacher to be able to offer memories of learning and not simply occasions to recite knowledge and information. For me, memories of learning are, to quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Stanley Cavell, strand over strand with memories of my life. I can recall with ease certain distinct moments, professors' encounters with people, texts, films, and other sources of the life of sensation that struck me. And such moments are what the French philosopher Roland Barthes refers to as the punctum that punctuates one's mental and emotional life. He's talking about photographs, and he says a photograph's punctum is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me. And though these moments carry with them insights and kernels of knowledge, they're also the remonstrations of feelings that resonate throughout a life. They are the events that compose a personality. I think Victor knew this, at least this is what I know from his many former students and from his books. A core element of his thinking in this regard and of his commitment to psychoanalysis as a philosophical enterprise and a way of doing political theory is that humans are bearers of stories that contain plot points, narratives, if you will, that express, though do not necessarily represent, what he calls personality, or what he called personality. A personality, he says in his very first book, The Revolutionary Personality of 1967, and I'm quoting, is a relatively stable organization of the ways in which the individual deals with his internal psychological conflicts and his involvement in and conflicts with external reality. The term personality, he will go on to explain, implies a cut, and here I hear the punctum, into the continuing developmental process, which is a human life. There are many lessons that arise from this very basic proposition that I see in the development of Victor's work, including, and I believe culminating in his final book, Talking Books, Toni Morrison Among the Ancestors. Allow me to touch on a few of these lessons before I move to the substance of my concerns today, because as I hope to show, Victor's practice of a critical political theory of reading of and especially listening to stories, and thus a critical political theory of personality, is at the heart of our current algorithmic condition, as we see it here. This was last night. While describing this way of reading and thinking about Morrison's oeuvre, Victor states that, and I'm quoting again, psychoanalytic reading requires an initial suspension of theoretical activity in order to enhance receptivity to affect and emergent meanings. In short, one reads as one listens. Victor's commitment to the incompleteness of human life, to personality as process rather than the idea of an individual as personhood, as an object of diagnosis, is explicit in this articulation of attention and acknowledgement. The reader is a listener, and listening is the most obscure, inconsistent, and fragile of democratic sensibilities. It's almost radically untheoretical if we consider that the word theory derives from the Greek theor, meaning seer. Victor's experience of reading Morrison distances us from the ocular tradition of theorizing, of witnessing, of knowing through the application of a method. His mode is too extreme of an epistemological position, and I believe too absolutist of a political disposition for him as well. The demand to procure evidence for suffering, say the kind of suffering often depicted in Morrison's novels of African American women, comes at the cost of a listening to suffering in song, in speech, in weeping, in revelation, in stories. Sound is as ephemeral as personality and as processual. Both are movements that resonate in the world. And if you expect to know a personality, to really know the who or the what of the individual person in order to recognize them as worthy of political legislation, then you're fooling yourself. This is why the listener and reader must suspend theoretical activity, by which I take Victor to mean that they must suspend the desire to know the truth of the person so as to be receptive to their personality as a manifold of events. Such lessons about personality as process are made explicit in Victor's most methodological book that I read as a kind of Wolfenstein manifesto, though it's a lot longer than most manifestos, his psychoanalytic Marxism groundwork, where he calls for the elimination of the extreme epistemological positions. Absolutist and nihilist knowledge claims, he says, are equally uninteresting. In between lie various theoretical and practical problems, more or less solved, more or less soluble, with various kinds of technical methods available for their solution. And this is where I think we are right now with this kind of stuff. In other words, the absolutist poles of knowing that appear in the desire to treat the representation of a life as a well-outlined portrait or object of investigation can't account for the fundamental processual dimensions of living. And personality for Victor is not the name of an object of inquiry, but a term, it's the best that he's got, to account for a kind of living and moving about in the world. Listening to and for personality gives us access to the vitalism of living, and decidedly not a portrait or biography of an individual. None of his books were biographies. None of the books that he worked on people were biographies. This is why the study of personality, I quote Victor once again, implies, going back to the previous quote, cut into the continuing developmental process, which is a human life. The aurality, A-U, aurality of personality, its likeness to sound and the demands it makes on attention as listening requires us to contend with human life as a moment in time, a fugue, if you will. Personality is a contrapuntal fugue, and so are our acts of living. I was never in a classroom with Victor. I only met him once, very briefly, when I first visited UCLA many, many years ago before moving here. But I continue to learn from his work and from how he worked. So I'm pretty much done interpreting his work, and I'm not going to analyze his radical personality, especially not in front of Judy and Moses. But I do wish to offer some brief reflections on how the project of Victor's work, at least as I've described it, might help me and help us appreciate the challenges that critical political theory faces today, and that we all face today, as regards our ubiquitous algorithmic condition. My reflections are part of a larger project that I'm calling Data Politique, that I define as the realpolitik of our contemporary present. And these reflections share a kinship with Victor's concerns about listening to the fugue of personality, and his concerns with the human urge to capture the essence of humanness once and for all. It's a curious thing about these seemingly alien and unhuman technologies, those calculations that participate in our lives that we at once embrace and reject, like a tumultuous love affair, that they are born of the all-too-human desire to unequivocally conquer the imponderable chasm between you and I, between myself and others, and between me and the world. Algorithms are technologies of personhood. My own contrapuntal fugue that I offer up for your listening today is an attempt to recollect our sensibilities about the relationship between technology and personality as we live it in the here and now. So one very final lesson from Victor: the radical tradition that Victor dedicated his entire life to explore, understand, and theorize is placed desperately under duress by the emergence of algorithmic technologies of the everyday. And I'm going to explain how I understand that to be the case in just a moment, though I'm not in a situation of panic about it. Rather, I'd want to treat it as an opportunity. The task is daunting because we're forced to ask ourselves, how do we think critically and politically about algorithms? It's a question that begs an investigation into the various traditions of critical inquiry, only perhaps to discover ourselves powerless and toolless in our attempts to answer the question. This because in asking how we can think critically about algorithms, we're not asking about our use of them, nor are we asking about their potential benefits or harms. Before condemning our algorithmic condition, I feel the pressure to ask this: what are the claims that these technical objects make on us, and how might we attend to these? If Victor offered up a mode of political or critical political theory as listening, what is our mode of attention to these non-human agents of political life? So to begin, what's an algorithm? And as you might expect, my answer is going to be straightforward. We don't know. Sort of. We know that it's a calculation, that it provides a series of computational rules for an input that generates an output, and we know that both the term algorithm and the mathematical operations we call algorithms emerge from a history of Europe's engagement with the Arabic world. Sorry, space is a little compromised here. Rodrigo Okigama explains that the term algorithm derives from the late Latin algorismus, from the name of the Islamic mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who you see pictured here, and this is his, one of the pages of his book, his first book on mathematics, on algorithms, whose manuscripts in Arabic were described the Indian system of arithmetic. The word's meaning eventually developed into the technical definition employed in today's computer science, which usually goes something like this: any well-defined computational procedure that takes some value or set of values as input and produces some value or set of values as output. The "and produces" part is the stuff that we don't know. This is as precise as the definition of algorithm can get. An even more concise and even more unambiguous one was proposed in the title of a famous 1979 paper written by the computer scientist Robert Kowalski, "Algorithm equals logic plus control." Andrew Goffey explains with similar succinctness that algorithms do things and their syntax embodies a command structure to enable this. And yet another scholar trying to provide a definition, Tarleton Gillespie, says, in the broadest sense, algorithms are encoded procedures for transforming input data into desired output based upon specified calculations. The procedures name both the problem and the steps by which it should be solved. Once again, it doesn't tell us anything. Now, all of these definitions are compelling, but they don't tell us much about algorithms. What I'm suggesting is that the definitional approach to understanding the political ontology of algorithms is not going to get us very far beyond Kowalski's perfectly succinct and accurate formula. And so it's by investigating the conditions of possibility of this medium that I propose we begin our reflections by addressing such questions as, what has made this medium so easily and so quickly a part of our existence and of our political lives? What is it about this medium that is so convincing and compelling and significant that we really can't do without it? And what is the mode of existence of the algorithmic medium? Okay, so in order to get at some of these questions, I'm going to try and outline some major problems that algorithms pose to our European tradition of critical political theory. In the discussion, or in the blurb, I think I stated that there was going to be 3, but that's not right. There's only going to be 2. The third one, I'll talk about it next year. There's not enough space here to talk about it. Okay, so the first problem. Algorithms are not representational structures, not in the manner that we typically understand what a representation is. There we go. This is a painting of a famous picture of Elvis. We recognize this as a painting of Elvis because we have it is a painting. You can't really, the definition doesn't let you see it. We have some memory of Elvis, or we have seen images of him in our collective psyche. And it is basically an imitation of the features of Elvis's face. It's not Elvis, but a representation of him, a likeness. What it actually is, if we wanted to be precise, is that it's paint on the flat surface that depicts an image of Elvis. After Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, the world lost all doubt as to whether a painting was anything other than paint on a flat surface. But typically, we are happy to say that we are currently looking at a painting of Elvis's face. And in the process of disobeying and refuting the lessons of his mentor Plato, Aristotle says exactly this about, not about Elvis, but about art. That it's an activity of verisimilitude whose nature is imitation, or mimesis. Imitation, he also says in the Poetics, is natural to man from childhood, one of his advantages over the lower animals being this, that he is the most imitative creature in the world and learns at first by imitation, and it is also natural for all to delight in works of imitation. So I have no trouble with this Aristotelian premise, and none of us do. The evidence for its consistency and perhaps even its truthfulness lies in the history of Western art that is more or less a history of media representation. Plato hated this, and Aristotle loved it. Plato would have us turn away from technologies of imitation. Aristotle understood imitation as human existence, and to turn away from it meant that you were either a slave, a beast, or a god. Imitation is what allows us to learn how to act, and our ability to act in the world is what makes us political animals. And here, imitation, representation, verisimilitude, they're all various definitions that have been used, or translations that have been used of the Greek word mimesis. However, you may land on the interminable debate between truth and appearance, eidos and eidolon, reality and imitation. The fact of the matter is that our modes of critical thinking and the myriad forms of critical political theorizing are one and the same with our critical reflections on and about forms of representation and their media. Critical thinking is thinking about representations, about the distinction between subject and object, about the relationship between representation and reality. And if you're not convinced, just think back to your reading of the first book, I'm assuming everybody's read it, of Hobbes's Leviathan, where he works so hard to set up his political theory of consent as a medium of representation. A contract is a technical medium that represents obligations, duties, and responsibilities. That is, actions. In order for it to work, you need authorship and language. And in this respect, and despite our common and collective wisdom about his rejection of the schools, Hobbes remains very close to Aristotle. There is no politics without representation, and there is no representation without technical media. But as I stated, an algorithm is not a medium of representation. It does not represent me or you, nor does it represent a world that is out there. It is a non-representational medium. And the formula logic plus control does not represent us with an appearance or does not present us with an appearance or reality. It's a modality of doing is non-mimetic. And my fear is that our history, our modes, and traditions of critical political theory are not equipped to deal with the political existence of non-representational media. If one of Victor's critical political theory questions is what is the mode of existence of personality, my question, or our question today, is what is the mode of existence of the algorithmic medium? So a second problem. So the first problem is that these don't represent anything. And if you want to sort of push it, and I'm going to try not to go off script too much because I know that time is of the essence. If you want to push it, that puts pressure on all our anxieties about privacy. None of what's happening in those technologies is representing you, so that nobody knows who or what you are. They just have data points. They just collect data points. It's not about your identity. And that's a problem, because we don't really know how to think about that. And so we always worry about privacy, because that's the only way we do know how to think about it. So the second problem stems from the first and requires a bit more explanation. Traditional approaches to critical political theory require or presuppose perceptual experience. Here's the problem. We don't experience algorithms. We experience paintings, we experience films, we experience one another, we experience chairs. We don't experience algorithms. And we experience computer screens and all the sort of hardware that we interact with. But algorithms are not non-experiential media. They are anesthetic. The best we can do, which is something most people can't do, is program. I can't program myself, nor can I analyze code. So what is the mode of criticism that is available to non-representational media or in non-experiential media? This question and the anxiety that it exudes is not lessened if instead of thinking about painting or portraiture, we think about photography, like the photograph of Elvis that is here. Photography is a 19th century invention that for all intents and purposes revolutionized how we think about art and politics. Many 20th century political cultural thinkers who have studied photography all agreed that the science and technology of photography and cinema pressured us to have to rethink our terms of critical discourse, given the mode of existence of this new technical object. Contrary to our most deeply held intuitions, photographs are not representations. They don't produce a likeness. Indeed, and for the first time in human history, photographs forced us to have to forego likeness as a criteria of aesthetic and political evaluation. Here's why. Photographs are photochemical transcription of an actual existing reality. That a photograph of Elvis is not a representation of Elvis, or this photograph of Elvis is not a representation of Elvis, like the portrait was a representation of Elvis. It is Elvis. He was there, present, when the photograph was taken. His presence was transcribed onto a photochemical surface to produce evidence of his existence. If this way of thinking about, or this ontology of the photographic image seems dubious, or maybe it rubs you the wrong way, just think about how pointless as evidence a painting of someone stealing a car might be, and how compelling a photograph of someone stealing a car is. What is more, no photograph is ever taken by a photographer. It's taken by a camera. And so I apologize, my friend Nicole, who's a photographer here, you've done none of the work. That the photographer sets up the shot and presses the button to release the shutter and expose the film simply means that the person has assisted the camera in capturing a reality. But it is the camera that takes the picture, not the photographer. Photography and movies, celluloid film, from the 19th century daguerreotype to the 1970s Polaroid, are automated realities, or to use the specialized language in question, they are automatisms. It took some time before a photograph could be considered side by side to a work of art, like poetry or painting. For much of the 19th century, photographs were demonized. Think of Gustave Baudelaire. Though praising the modernism of his time and lamenting the capacity of so few artists to capture its beauty and its movement, he was among the most damning of the detractors of photography. And I'm going to read, or you're going to read with me, one of his most damning kinds of passages from his Salon writings of 1859. During this lamentable period, a new industry arose, which contributed can you read it? It's all right. Listen. Which contributed not a little to confirm stupidity in its faith and to ruin whatever might remain of the divine in the French mind. The idolatrous mob demanded an ideal worthy of itself and appropriate to its nature that is perfectly understood in matters of painting and sculpture. The present-day credo of the sophisticated, above all in France, and I do not think that anyone at all would dare to state the contrary, is this: I believe in nature, and I believe only in nature. There are good reasons for that. I believe that art is and cannot be other than the exact reproduction of nature. A timid and dissident sect would wish to exclude the more repellent objects of nature, such as skeletons or chamber pots. This industry that could give us a result identical to nature would be the absolute of art. A revengeful God has given ear to the prayers of this multitude. Daguerre was his Messiah, and now the faithful says to him, since photography gives us every guarantee of exactitude that we could desire, they really believe that, the mad fools, then photography and art are the same thing. For that moment, our squalid society rushed Narcissus to a man to gaze at its trivial image on a scrap of metal. A madness and extraordinary fanaticism took possession of all these new sun worshippers. So this is in the mid-1800s. I should note that there has never been a moment, as far as I know, when an expression of moral panic hasn't coincided with the emergence of a new technology. This was the case with the poets for Plato, it was the case with comedy for Racine, it was the case with the 18th century novel, it was the case with photography, film, telegraph, radio, telephone, and now digital media. And it's for this reason that I wish to pose the questions that I do regarding the mode of existence of the algorithm before I make any judgments about its normative value as an instrument. Now, returning to Baudelaire's condemnation, it is to our listening humorous and the kind of thing that if I were to say it at home to my son, he'd likely respond by saying, okay, boomer, which he does because he doesn't understand the difference between a Gen Xer and a boomer. Anybody who's old is a boomer now. Thank you, popular media. But it's also a perfect snapshot, and I pardon the pun, of the sentiments of the period. Baudelaire derides the opinions of a multitude that are attracted to this new kind of image and its seemingly exalted mode of satisfying the human desire to be one with reality. But he does so relying on classic aesthetic conventions that were well ensconced and in place in the period. He chooses his words wisely. He doesn't concede that a new practice has arisen, but a new industry. A photograph is the product of labor, not of art. And what's worse, it is the automated labor. The word industry marks this conjunction, since the French word industrie means both labor or effort and mechanical automated movement. That by this point in the 19th century European life is synonymous with the steam engine and its ubiquity in the factory. Moreover, the photograph corrupts the divinity of mind, the traditional source and spring of genius, genius being the political and legal justification in France for an object to count as a work of art. We'll talk about this in just a second. So this squalid invention, Baudelaire insists, claims a relationship to nature that the artist's hand could never procure, and it's precisely this that stings him to the core, and he knows this. He knows that photographs capture a reality, and they don't represent one. I just suggested that Baudelaire's vitriol is a perfect expression of the period, and I want to show how this 19th century moment of the rise of photography bears a family resemblance to our current algorithmic condition. So as I've just noted, the 19th century proved a tumultuous time for the art world, especially in Europe. It was a time that saw the emergence of new technical media that infiltrated aesthetic practices and challenged the conventions of art. This was especially palpable in post-revolutionary France, where the legitimacy of the fine arts had been codified into law by the 1793 Declaration of the Rights of Genius by the National Assembly. This law protected materials that were productions of mind or genius. That's the actual translation, productions of mind of genius. It was a law that did something more than render works of art objects of property, although it did that. The language of the 1793 Declaration made it so that the works were an extension of the artist, legally defined as a coherent personality, not just something the maker had acquired through labor. And there again, the distinction between art and labor. And so here's one of the many elements that contributes to a modern conception of a technical medium. A medium's mode of existence is not determined by what it makes, its output, but by the nature of the actions that went into the production of the output. In order for a work of art to count as one, it needed to be distinguished from mere mechanical labor. And what makes that distinction possible is the attribution of human intention to the work in question, which makes it a product of mind or genius. Hence the many disputes that arose in the period regarding artistic production and its relationship to labor, including the disputes that were at the Paris Commune's short-lived attempt at overcoming the division between fine and decorative arts. Decorative arts being the things that the laborers sort of did. The 1793 Declaration demanded that any artist who wanted to claim artistic status for their work had to verify that the object was not simply a mechanical reproduction, but it is what today we might call an original work. And this means that creating an image or a sculpture mechanically or automatically is not protected by copyright, according to a December 2, 1804 decision of France's Supreme Court. A decision that determined, and I quote, that there is no infringement in taking further casts from the master mold without the consent of its original author or manufacturer. A mold is a form of mechanical reproduction that produces casts automatically. No one sculpts the product of a mold. Though the output may be two identical busts, these two busts are not the same thing. These legal and aesthetic considerations into the mode of existence of a work of art were the basis for a decision upheld by the 1834 Correctional Tribunal with regard to Napoleon's death mask, which we see here, molded by his physicians, Francois Antomarchi. The process of capturing by means of taking a mask from another person's face could not establish an exclusive right. The judges indicated that if one were to compare the product of a purely manual operation to the work that a sculptor has produced, that would have amounted to extending the provisions of the lay beyond what was a work of mind or of genius. In short, what the famous 20th century cultural critic Walter Benjamin would eventually call the age of mechanical reproducibility was such due to an associational milieu emergent from a series of legal, artistic, scientific, and technical practices that eventually would elevate the products of mechanical technology as objects of copyright. This division between labor and work, between automaticity and human genius, were very much in play in an 1862 case that stood before France's Supreme Court and that remains a watershed decision for the artistic status of automatically produced art objects like photographs. Known as the Meyer and Pearson case, they were the company that were making these photographs. The matter regarded the appropriation of a famous Meyer and Pearson photograph of the Italian Count Cavour. This is the photograph of political celebrity of 19th century Europe, Cavour's carte de visite, and this is something that was very popular in the 19th century. Everybody had little sort of calling cards with their pictures on. Not everybody, people who could afford them. Had calling cards with their pictures on it. They were basically the 19th century selfie. These pictures of the Count Cavour had become even more popular after his death, and those taken by the Meyer and Pearson photography company were especially sought after because they were a very famous carte de visite photography company. So much so that they had been reproduced by various other companies and sold as their own, and therein lies the problem. This lawsuit was a watershed decision. It was a copyright lawsuit and was a watershed decision that allowed something other than a hand-drawn image to count as a work of visual art. And basically the decision kept going and going and going until it went to the Supreme Court, at which point they had to sort of make the most vaguest kind of argument possible to suggest that a photograph actually was the expression of a certain kind of style, the style of the photographer, and therefore create that link and break and create the association between photographer and the photograph that was broken by the automatic snapping of the picture that was not an agency of the photographer. In short, the issue of the 62 decision blurred the distinction between automatic activity and mechanical activity and artistic work. And this shook the 19th century to its core. If mechanical reproduction could count as a work of genius and be protected by copyright, as a photograph now could, then any automatism, including mechanical human labor, could also have value. And if that is the case, then the product of one's labor should count as one's property. So now we're starting to see how, there's a very famous guy who starts worrying about this. It's no surprise then that Karl Marx would ultimately land on the term proletariat as the political name for his revolutionary class of workers, proletarians, from the Latin proletarius being, according to the classification of peoples by the 6th Roman king Servius Tullius, a citizen of the lowest class who served the state not with his property, but only with his children, his proles. So basically, proletarians were sex machines. And that's the only thing that they contributed to the well-being of a population and to the well-being of a nation. All other things being equal, so was it the case for the 19th century laborer, who reproduces commodities mechanically and automatically, at least according to Marx's famous discussion of this. After the 1862 decision on photography, it becomes possible to count the product of an automatic reproduction as valuable enough to warrant copyright protection, which also means that those other automatisms, including labor and the products of labor, could count as legitimate human activity worthy of copyright or property protection. By granting mechanical reproductions the status of property, the Meyer-Pearson decision opened the door for all forms of automatisms to potentially hold copyright and thus property and commercial value. Now, these political, legal, and aesthetic and theoretical concerns regarding the nature of the photographic medium made possible a rethinking of the line that divides human work and machine work, and they put weight on the privileged intuition that human agency is a special kind of activity, that there is something about human activity that distinguishes it either from the happenstance of nature or the roteness of automatic movement. So my time is slowly running out, I hope not too quickly, and so I'm going to raise two more observations. What does all this business about photography have to do with the task at hand? In part, as you might have sensed, the question raised by this entanglement of issues finds kinship with Victor's own attention to personality, to narrative, and to the nature of political life. Indeed, and as I repeatedly suggest to all my students, the invention and proliferation of any technical medium always reintroduces the question of the nature of humanness and of the relationship between life and world. Think of Galileo's telescopic lens, of Gutenberg's press, of Plato's cave again, Aristotle's Homer, and now Google's algorithms. More than representational instruments or transmission devices, media are transformational objects that intermediate worldly life. So to be brief, let's see if this works. Yes, we don't need audio for this. Here's my next point. The motive existence of the algorithm is not akin to either painting or photography. The algorithmic image isn't an image at all for two fundamental reasons. The first is historical. We're not in a position to grasp its possible genealogy. And the second reason is existential. The philosopher David Roderick explains it this way. Algorithmic forms are also without an image in the sense that what appears on an electronic or digital screen does not fully conform to the criteria by which, in the past, we have come to recognize something as created, aesthetic image. And he continues, on electronic screens, we are uncertain that what happens before us is an image. And the reason why I chose to connect the dots is that I think, to me anyways, this comes closest to a certain technology or a certain experience that we've had about how the algorithmic technology works, which is it quite literally connects a set of data points, connects dots. In such reflections, Roderick raises concerns similar to those provoked by Meyer and Pearson. He's telling us that an algorithmic image is neither a representation of reality nor a transcription of it like photography or cinema. but something else, perhaps something closer to a transcoding operation. The digital camera does not photochemically transcribe an image, and this, unfortunately, there's no audio, but this is what this is explaining. It doesn't transcribe an image. What it does is that it captures electronic impulses, codifies them as information, and arranges them in such a way as to produce an image. And so we're dealing with electrical impulses and not photochemical, right? These are and the problem, and so what's the problem? The problem is that the world doesn't have to exist in order to have an algorithmic image. So with these preliminary set of reflections, we begin to sense that the mode of existence of the algorithm requires a rethinking of both what a medium is and the types of forms of political and aesthetic criticism available to it. The algorithm isn't a specific medium, but a dynamic of functions that generate outputs. And given that so much of our practices of political theorizing are framed by the representational power of word and image, how might we think the non-representational and anesthetic dynamics of capture, of rendering, of transcoding, of information, and of calculation, how might we think of these politically? When we look at a digital image, what we view on our screens has little basis in physical reality. It's wholly virtual, and it's all fake news. This is a website that you can all go to. I'll click on it later if you want. None of these pictures are of real people in the world. They're algorithmically generated pictures. None of these people exist in the world. So we can begin to consider that the transformative power of the algorithm is less one of representing or transcribing reality, but of capturing data and disposing it automatically. In short, algorithms move us. And this, I believe, is the fundamental difference between representing, transcribing, and transcoding. Algorithms possess what I wish to call dispositional powers that are neither determinate, like Newton's law of gravity, nor wholly indeterminate, like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The disposition powers of algorithms do not operate to constrain freedom, but on the contrary, and this is another problem, they invite and incite us to constantly move automatically all about. The aim of political power is no longer the domination of the present, but the management of futures. So finally, how might we understand this algorithmic condition of perpetual mobility? Again, I'm going to be very brief. And I'm going to turn very quickly to cybernetics. Cybernetics was the name that was developed by a group of MIT polyglots to refer to all the experiments that they were doing in mathematics and calculation of information. In his seminal book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in Animal and Machine, Norbert Wiener states that he and his colleagues decided to call the entire field of control and communication theory, whether in the machine or the animal, and it's important that there's no distinction, by the name cybernetics, which we get from the Greek word kybernetes, or steersman. In choosing this term, they recognize the significance of J. Clerk Maxwell's paper entitled Governors, which is a paper about the steering of ships, and control mechanisms of how feedback mechanisms. The feedback mechanism, or negative feedback, refers to the corrective mechanisms for the control of movement in space and time. The problem and the idea all began in World War II, and it was the problem of radar technology. How is it possible to hit a random moving target with accuracy? The specific target was the German Luftwaffe, and the projectile was a US and British anti-aircraft fire. In an important 43 paper entitled Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology, Wiener and his colleagues established a founding abstraction of cybernetics and of our algorithmic condition. At the level of observable movement, humans are no different from machines. This means that information has a behavioral component. It moves about. And what matters in the study of cybernetics is not the behavior of individual beings, but the behavior of information emitted by moving entities, including humans or animals or machines. This because human behavior can be reduced to a set of informational impulses at once traceable and identifiable, and now we're starting to understand what the situation is all about. In short, our cyberneticists accepted the behavioral description of movement provided by Pavlov and Skinner that gives primacy to all those moments of human living that are automatic. Here's how one historian describes it. Jay Hoban says, the tracking radar and the human trackers played the same role, almost as if each were servo mechanisms. Both introduced similar high-frequency correction activity that could be filtered out. The totally automatic system, with its sensory input, processing and aiming and firing output, seemed almost lifelike. And now here's Wiener's description in the 1950s. The term feedback is also implied in a more restricted sense to signify that human behavior of an object is controlled by the margin of error at which the object stands at a given time with reference to a specific goal. The feedback mechanism is negative. That is, its signals from the goals are used to restrict outputs which would otherwise go beyond the goal. All purposeful behavior may be considered to require negative feedback. Negative feedback is a central feature of the political existence of the algorithm. It's the great cybernetic achievement that allows for successful signal transmission to be the model of all purposeful behavior, and whose success relies on a corrective set of rules that persistently send signals of information back and forth between user and interface so as to restrict outputs and maximize the success of future outcomes. Neither conscious nor unconscious, negative feedback operates at the level of the automatism of purposeful human behavior, as does the stimulus response condition described by Skinner. All right, so I'm going to conclude very quickly now and suggest that there are about 3 or 4 parameters that we still need to deal with. The first one, that I just put away, the first one has to do with prediction. Negative feedback is an automated mechanism for the prediction of future outcomes. And so we're dealing with a technology that is thinking about the future and not the present or the past. A second parameter is uncertainty. Because all of these calculations are coming from the world of probability, the cybernetic world is random, and hence the need for control and communication. The third parameter of negative feedback is that it relies on the communication of impulses. These impulses, a mouse, a click, a Facebook-like register change that is transcoded as data. And this is important to sort of understand. For me, when I understood this, it sort of kind of blew my mind. When we talk about companies collecting data, right, it's not the name you put down. Right? It has nothing to do with the name that you're putting down, with your gender, with your age, with who you are. The whole point of this technology is that it has no interest in who you are. The data that it's collecting is when you're scrolling on a page and you stop. How long are you stopping for? What's on that page? Why is it that you're stopping at that page? All right, how does that coordinate with other people your age who have stopped at that point on that page on the same web page? And how do those correlations generate possible outcomes in terms of advertising, in terms of desires, in terms of perceptions, et cetera, et cetera? You're not giving data by punching it in. You're giving data by just looking at the screen. That's why it's a technology of perception and attention. It has nothing to do with who we are and where we come from and who our parents are and whether we were ever members of the Communist Party. Okay, finally, the discrete serialization of everyday life, and this is related to this last point. Data is the marker of a change that is captured at the micro moment and transformed into a discrete value that coordinates a series of discrete values so as to create a probabilistic sequence. Excuse me. So it's on the basis of these considerations that in my work I've chosen to study the dispositional powers of algorithms. These dispositional powers, I want to say, are peculiar in the sense that they neither determine the way we are, nor do they predict necessarily what we're going to do within any sort of exactness. Rather, the algorithm is a dispositional power not because of the constraints on freedom or the psychological, physical forms of confinement, but because it proliferates mobility and therefore arranges bodies. Hence its status as what I want to say, a sentimental medium, which sounds really weird, but it's a medium that moves bodies. Some of the writers of the modern period, David Hume, one of my favorites, Samuel Pufendorf, Jane Austen, the Earl of Shaftesbury, William James, Henry Bergson, Catherine Coburn, understood that human action is spurred by automatic responses to an external world that moves us. These automatic human responses are what Adam Smith would call the moral sentiments. And these thinkers help us appreciate that our sentiments are not static emotions, but dynamic dispositional powers that extend us into the world, or for that matter, recoil us from it. Along similar lines, a critical political theory of the algorithm attends to the ways in which these technological objects arrange the movement of bodies in space and time by organizing perception, attention, and behavior differently. That is, by transforming perception, attention, and behavior through such automated responses as negative feedback, statistical probability, risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera. So where does that leave us, ontologically and politically? Very confused and perhaps disturbed. Disturbed not just because the situation feels troubling, though I kind of want to say no more troubling than how Baudelaire felt about photography, but disturbed also because it seems clear to me that we don't yet have a way of thinking critically about the political theory of algorithms, and because it feels like traditional forms of critical political theory are insufficient to the task. To worry about the circulation of falsities like fake news, to worry about the privacy invasion and all other concerns affiliated with more traditional forms of political theory seems off the mark to me. This is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned with these things. That would be just totally insane. But it just doesn't seem to me that that way of concerning ourselves with the world is especially, efficacious when dealing with algorithms. Like it or not, we can't condemn algorithms because we can't turn away from them or turn them off. Planes would crash, traffic would come to a halt, life support systems would stop, not to mention our entire living infrastructure, and, as it turns out, democratic elections would collapse. The fact of algorithmic ubiquity just makes this so. So yes, we end on a confusing and perplexing note and with a daunting task ahead of us. That said, I hope that my remarks tonight might help orient us in some way, shape, or form on how we might begin, as Victor advises, to enact an initial suspension of theoretical activity in order to enhance receptivity to the radical personality of our contemporary moment. Thank you very much.